A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects, Chapter 6, 2nd edition. We're moving towards the 1990s now. It's 1989, and 2nd edition is all about 2nd edition AD&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Gary Gygax had been working on a revised edition of 1st edition AD&D for a while before he got essentially pushed out of the company. So the reins were taken over by David Zeb Cook, who had previously been behind the expert rules that followed Tom Moldvay's basic rules, and had done a lot of other things over the years. I'm not entirely certain how different the published version of 2nd edition is from what Gygax had in mind. I suspect there's quite a lot of overlap, but nevertheless, that Cook and his team took some things out. 2nd edition, as I say, is released in 1989, but it lasts for the whole of the 90s, so it's sort of something that we associate with the 90s, and it's the most popular role-playing game throughout that decade. It's eventually replaced by 3rd edition in 2000, but we'll come to that in a couple of chapters' time. And it's certainly challenged for dominance during the 1990s. Again, we'll look at that in the next chapter when we look at other games of the 90s and other important industry moves of the 1990s. For now, though, we're going to concentrate in this chapter on 2nd edition AD&D in its many forms. As with 1st edition, there was a new player's handbook. There was a new Dungeon Master's Guide. One little difference, though, with 2nd edition is that rather than have a monster manual as a single hardback book initially, what TSR released was this, which is Object 44, the Monstrous Compendium, which, as you can see, is a ring binder with loose leaf monster pages. Here's a red and silver dragon pages. And the idea was that you would buy various supplements and loose leaf monster pages would come in those supplements. You could take those supplements out, or you would get extra pages in Dragon magazine and so on, and you could put them in your folder, which is a brilliant idea in theory. It's got some flaws in practice, and the main flaw is that the pages were, on fairly cheap paper, and they ripped very easily. And even the binders tend to get a bit battered about because they're so bulky. That's much bigger and harder to stick in a bag if you're carrying things around. So this one's actually in pretty decent condition. Even that's got a bit of scuffing there. Most of the ones that we ever get in stock in the shop tend to be rather battered and a bit of a mess. It's interesting that eventually, after 2 or 3 ring binders and many appendices that you could buy separately, and many extra pages that came in box sets and so on, eventually, when TSR came around to reissuing 2nd edition with new artwork and a few changes here and there, if you've ever seen the black bordered rulebooks, which we sometimes refer to as 2.5th edition, when they came around to doing that, they actually did go back to having what they call the Monstrous Manual as a single hardback. And that's the format that they've used ever since. It was an interesting experiment, but I think we probably have to conclude that the loose leaf Monsters Compendium wasn't ultimately a success. But at least they tried. So that was Object 44 in our list of 101 objects, and all the objects, or most of the objects in this chapter, are going to be different from different campaign settings. Because 2nd edition is the age of the campaign setting, the official TSR campaign setting. Oh yes. We'd had different campaign settings, of course, in 1st edition, like Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms and so on, and they're all back. But there's a huge proliferation of officially backed TSR campaign settings that come out during the time of 2nd edition. All with support, all with novel lines, all with lots of adventures, or with box sets. 2nd edition is also the age of the boxed set. So let's have a look at some of these. Let's start off with Object 45. Forgotten Realms, I said, came out at the end in the last chapter we looked at. Forgotten Realms came out at the end of the 1st edition and really comes into its own in second edition. From now on, it's the default setting for D&D. And here's an example, not only of a Forgotten Realms product, but also one of these boxed sets. Let's do a little bit of an unboxing, shall we? What do you get in? This is essentially, it's called City of Splendors. This is the Waterdeep boxed set. Fantastic piece. You get a lot of stuff in here. You get some really nice glossy maps of Castle Waterdeep. There you go. You get quite a lot of maps. Look at this. Of Waterdeep itself, floor plans. That's a poster. And then you get, it's a well-packed box set, this one. Really nice condition too. And they have the game in artwork. Second edition, by now, we've got the 4 horsemen in terms of the 4 key famous staff artists at TSR. That's Larry Elmore, Jeff Easley, Clyde Caldwell and Keith Parkinson. And if you look at second edition, probably the majority of second edition products from TSR have covers from one of those 4. Where you get exceptions is where they've identified a particular artist who they think is going to be the key artist for that product line. We'll come to that. We'll come to a couple of those actually. So that's a Forgotten Realms product. There's a ton of Forgotten Realms material comes out in second edition. Dragonlance, of course, was huge in first edition. That's back for second edition. Here's an adventure, Dragon Dawn. One thing that came in with second edition Dragonlance is moving to a different continent. So it's on the world of Kryn, but no longer on the continent of Ansalon. This one is the continent of Taladas, largely untouched by the War of the Lands. That's Object 46. 47, Lankhmar. Lankhmar comes back for second edition. So that essentially that's largely the same thing as was produced for first edition Lankhmar, the City of Adventure supplement. But there's a lot more adventures come out for second edition for Lankhmar. Again, really nice. Lovely pull-out map of Lankhmar, which I'll open up. Slightly damaged copy with a sellotape down the middle, but really nice city map. So that's Lankhmar. That's Object 47. That's our third campaign setting. Greyhawk, of course, was Gary Gygax's setting, and Greyhawk is back for second edition, even without Gary Gygax around. There's a whole series of adventures for Greyhawk, the second edition. And actually, some of them are the first couple, like Gargoyle, for example, are actually for first and the second edition. They sort of straddle the barrier. Gygax, essentially, when he leaves, he loses the rights to the Greyhawk world, and the Greyhawk name and Greyhawk characters. So TSR can carry on using stuff about Mordenkainen, for example, even though that was one of Gygax's own player characters. Seems a little, well, unlucky. There you go. That was Object 48. Object 49, if you remember basic D&D and BECMI D&D, they use the known world setting, which comes to be called Mystara. In the time of second edition AD&D, that world becomes one of the AD&D worlds as well. And there are a few products that are released for AD&D for Mystara. And I'm a huge Mystara fan. It's still largely identified with that basic expert companion Masters Immortal set of rules, but there are some nice second edition products that come out rather later on. So here is the Monsters Compendium appendix. This is late enough that they've gone back to using appendices for the Monsters Compendium as books rather than loose leaf products. But this gives you some of the, if I can find, do we get? Yeah, Rakasta, for example, which is probably one of the more famous Mystara races that you don't usually get in AD&D. If you want Rakasta stats, there you go. You would use that. Object 49. Object 50, another sort of a holdover from first edition AD&D, is Ravenloft. Now, in first edition, Ravenloft was a pair of adventures. and not really develop a campaign setting. What they did in second edition is to actually turn it into a campaign setting. So you get things like this, lots of supplements, lots of adventures. Some of my favourite stuff was Ravenloft. I loved Ravenloft as a campaign setting. So it's gothic horror. It's fantasy gothic horror. So it's, if you go, if you watch Hammer horror films, the sort of films that would have starred Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee or Vincent Price, that are, you know, they're set in some Eastern European village in the 14th century, and there's a vampire lives in their castle. That's sort of Ravenloft. And then later on, there's, I suppose there's another campaign setting, which I didn't really include, but is sort of Ravenloft, and that's Mask of the Red Death, which is the same kind of thing, only 19th century. And explicitly set in a 19th century Europe with gothic horror elements. Which I think is probably the first official TSR AD&D or D&D release that was set on Earth. So that's Ravenloft, and Mask of the Red Death as well. And that was object 50, so we're almost halfway through our list of 101 objects. The first brand new campaign setting, I think, for second edition, I think it would be just about the first one, would be Dark Sun. And here's a Dark Sun product. This is, unusually for the time, this is a hardback rather than a box set. Although the main Dark Sun campaign settings were box sets. And their adventures came in boxes with ring-bound booklets for the DM and so on, which is interesting. We don't have a copy in stock, but the revised edition of the basic campaign setting box set is famous for including a cloth map, which is nicknamed the Tea Towel, because it literally is. It's like a linen cloth map, and that's quite a nice one to have. Quite sought after and quite valuable. Dark Sun was a very different campaign setting, very much fantasy, but very much not traditional Western fantasy, set in a sort of a dry, deserty world. Psionics are very, very important, and a lot of the standard races don't exist, and gladiators are important. Quite exotic, and still very, very popular. Whenever there's a new product comes out for 5th edition, or rumoured, you always see people saying, "Oh, can it be Dark Sun?" It's usually Dark Sun. So that's Object 51. Object 52, another campaign setting. This one, again, one of my favourites, Spelljammer. Another box set here. Now, Spelljammer was a fantasy space setting, but not a fantasy space setting in the way that, say, Starfinder of today is a fantasy space setting. No, Spelljammer is elves in space on giant wooden starships kind of thing. Very exotic, visually very striking, and very different. And it also had the conceit that this was an obvious upgrade path for your player characters, in that the conceit was that Spelljammer setting actually connected many of the other D&D settings. So Forgotten Realms was on a particular planet, Greyhawk was on another planet, Dragonlance was on another planet, but they were all planets in the same universe, and you could voyage with Spelljammer from world to world. So if your Greyhawk characters had got to a certain high level and wanted to go off and do something different, Spelljammer was not a mistake. In fact, I actually did this in my campaign. I'm going to show you some of the sort of stuff that you get in here. This is the Legend of Spelljammer box set, quite rare. Here are deck plans of the legendary Spelljammer starship. Yeah, a few books. Something you get in a lot of these second edition box sets is you get cards for various purposes. So here you've got DM summary of NPCs on board the Spelljammer. Quite why that needs to be a card and not just a page in a book, I don't know. We also get all these really wonderful reference cards for the different ships, and I think the artwork on these is fantastic. They're so different and imaginative. These aren't like your standard fantasy spaceships. They are genuinely weird. fantastic imagination, love them. Love Spelljammer, absolutely love it. And one day, I'm optimistic, one day Spelljammer will return to D&D published. We hope. So that's Spelljammer. That's object number 52. Object number 53 is, I suppose, is connected to Forgotten Realms, but it's Al-Qadim. And Al-Qadim was Middle East Arabian Nights kind of fantasy, and is part of the Forgotten Realms. It's sort of down and a bit to the right. So here's an example. We've not got much Al-Qadim in stock at the moment. We had a bit of a run on it and we've sold out a lot. This is the one item we've got left in stock at the moment, the complete Shire's Handbook, one of the complete handbook series, which I'll come to shortly. Shire is, they are elemental mages, one of the character classes in Al-Qadim. Nice stuff, Al-Qadim. Some very, what it was particularly good at, there was a number of sort of mini boxed sets, which were bundles of short adventures, and they're fantastic. I've used those in my campaign for sort of filler adventures, even though I wasn't actually running an Al-Qadim campaign. I was running a campaign that involved going to many different islands, and they were a good thing to sort of fit in, not necessarily combat oriented as much as keeping your wits about you kind of thing. Like them a lot. What a good stuff here. So that's Al-Qadim. That was number 53. Number 54 is another sort of semi-Forgotten Realms expansion, and that's Mazdika. Now, Mazdika is the sort of Central and Southern American part of the Forgotten Realms world. So the plot is it's sort of conquistador kind of setting. So I mentioned before that many of these settings had their own novel series. Mazdika was no different. Here's the first Mazdika novel, Doug Niles' Ironhelm, part of book 1 of the Mazdika trilogy. And you can see if I hold that up, you can see very much, conquistador, Cervantes kind of setting. You can imagine Don Quixote getting on a boat. I know Don Quixote isn't conquistador. Okay, bear with me. Don Quixote getting on a boat and finding people with wooden swords, that kind of thing. So that's Mazdika. That was 54. 55, possibly the most famous new campaign setting, and one that continues to have ongoing presence, if you like, in the role-playing society, even without official product to back it up, and that's Planescape. Planescape, hugely influential. It sort of superseded Spelljammer and was rather more serious and probably highbrow, I suppose. An extra planar setting, so lots of plane travel, quite deep, quite profound at times, and very much with a particular artist called Tony DiTerlizzi. Did a lot of the artwork. I think this is one of his. Again, let's do an unboxing. That reminds me, we were going to talk about specific artists, and we didn't mention when we did talked about Dark Sun. We should have talked about Brom, the artist, who is the artist specifically associated with Dark Sun. But for Planescape, it's more Tony DiTerlizzi. This is the Planescape stuff is very sought after. The Planescape box sets particularly, but I see even the softback adventures now going for 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 pounds. The box set's typically at 100 pounds or so or more. Really nice stuff. It's all quite... You'll either love it or you won't with Planescape. It's probably not a combat heavy kind of setting. And if you're looking for more traditional fantasy, this is clearly not it. But if you're looking for something a bit different in D&D, I think you might get a lot out of Planescape. Worth checking out. A lot of good stuff. And it changed the way that I think people saw what potentially you could do with D&D. And also with role-playing games. Monty Cook did a lot of work on Planescape. Well, he wasn't as creator of the setting, but did a lot of work late on Planescape. Some of the more famous adventures, for example. and you can see the influences on his later work in stuff like Numenera or The Invisible Sun. So Planescape, that was number 55 in our object list. Object 56 actually is probably the one that's most forgotten of these campaign settings, and I think it was probably the last one to be released as well. You can get a clue to that in that it's this is the original campaign box set for Birthright. Is that the logo there is the 2.5th edition, the revised logo. Or the earlier Advanced Dungeons and Dragons actually says 2nd edition. By this point, they've dropped the 2nd edition. So what's different about Birthright? Because on the face of it, it's a European fantasy setting. The twist is, it's a fantasy setting where divine right of kings is actually a thing in reality. The people who are rulers are born to be rulers and are specially blessed because of their birthright in that way. And a large part of the game is actually wargaming between different realms. If I can show you get this, again. Let's do an unboxing. You get this rather silly folding cardboard box to put these cards in. I'll show you the cards in a minute. Usual sort of softback books, rule book. Yes, rule book, not just a campaign. Nice maps. What I wanted to show you here, really nice condition, this particular set, is it comes complete with all of these unit cards, which are included in the wargame system. It's not, incidentally, it's not battle system. It's not War Machine. It's TSR's latest stab at doing a war game to go along with D&D, and actually it works pretty well. And there are expansions that come out later that cover things like naval battles as well, and it's really quite an interesting setting. And it seems to have been largely forgotten. There is a small hardcore group of people still playing it, or at least I stumbled across a website not that long ago, and there does seem to be an active community, but it's a small active community. I suspect of all this pile of campaign settings, I think it's the one that I don't think I'd expect Wizards of the Coast to release a 5th edition. Whereas I think there's a decent chance that at some point we see Dark Sun. And I think there's a good chance that we would see something like Planescape as well, and maybe Spelljammer. But I think Birthright is less likely. Now, remember I showed you the complete Shair's handbook for Al-Qadim? Well, that was the Al-Qadim specific release in a range called the Complete X Handbook. They look like this: Player's Handbook Rules Supplement, or PHBR series. And the idea, you buy one of these, and it gives you, if you're fighting, you buy the Complete Fighter's Handbook. You're a fighter player, yes, player. And it gives you extra options for playing fighters. It gives you, extra, what they call kits, which I suppose are sort of like specialisms and subclasses. There's extra combat rules, extra equipment and weapons and so on. And it's a fun thing and gives you more options if you want to play a fighter. And the clever thing about this is, it's something that players would buy, because most D&D books up until this point, for the most part, would have been bought by the DM. Rule books bought by the DM. Campaign settings bought by the DM. Adventures bought by the DM. And if you think, there's probably 5 times as many players as there are DMs. So by releasing things for players, TSR realised actually we could make more money. And these are hugely successful. We get so many of these in the shop. They are really, really common. So TSR in the day must have sold a lot of them. And there's one for every class and subclass. Okay, it starts off with, fighter, thief, wizard, priest, etc. But later on you get, for more obscure ones like Shair, you get, the Complete Ninja's Handbook. There's also sort of DM ones as well in blue, which otherwise look similar. Things like sages and specialists, just the DM. And also in the same format, there's a really nice range of historical reference books, only they're green, which allow you to play AD&D second edition in particular historical settings. So there's a Vikings one, there's a Celts one, there's a Charlemagne's Paladins one, and this was all, I suppose, this is part of an explosion in product during the 90s. That TSR really starts churning out a lot of product, and to be fair to them, it's mostly pretty good. I think you'll find some, old school purists who say it's not as good as it was in my day when it was, crappy cover art and, you'd get 8 pages in an adventure, but they were good pages. But for the most part, I disagree with those people. I think a lot of really good stuff came out during the second edition era. And incidentally, this is after Gary Gygax's FTSR. For the most part, this is TSR under Lorraine Williams's control. If you remember the sidebar that we had about how Gary lost control of TSR. And I wonder how much of this is Lorraine Williams being essentially a decent businesswoman, and seeing the way to be a successful, profitable role-playing games publisher is to, and this will sound really drastic, publish role-playing games. Because no question, in the 90s, TSR published a lot. Of course, the trouble is if you publish a lot, and particularly if you have your product spread across many different ranges, is that you are spreading your user base quite thin. So rather than, if you look at current day D&D, where there is 5th edition and the amount of product being put out by Wizards of the Coast is really quite limited. It's one item every 2 or 3 months, whereas in 2nd edition it's many items every month. If you think about that, everybody has a good awareness of the core products, and there's a good chance that everybody bought, I don't know, Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, for example. Whereas how many people will have bought to use an example, how many people will have bought the Planescape Planes of Chaos box set? For one thing, it was quite expensive at the time. Secondly, how many people are playing or running Planescape? Because, out of every 10 people playing AD&D 2nd edition, probably a large number are playing their own campaign, and it's nothing like Planescape, so there'll be no relevance there. Let's say there are 5 people who are running various different campaigns. Probably, it's 2 or 3 of those are Forgotten Realms, and maybe 1 is Dark Sun, and maybe 1 is something else. So you're spreading your user base very thin, and the problem with that is if the market shrinks, then all of a sudden you look a bit exposed, and you've got stock that you've paid people to write, but stock that's not shifting. And we're going to look at the implications for that in the next chapter. But for now, that was chapter 6, AD&D 2nd edition. Thank you, and see you next time.